On the lead on this Sunday morning, and with a little bit of a pause in the most important racing action leading up to Breeders' Cup, we obviously covered a lot of hard news this morning earlier, and we'll spend probably the rest of the show on a very important topic. The Tomco Bar Racing Integrity Act that would introduce the United States Anti-Doping Agency as a sort of umbrella management of everything involving medication and testing and penalties is being forwarded by a certain group of elite organizations in the game and will attempt to go through Congress. The assumption is that it'll be hard-pressed to make much headway there, but aside from that, there's specifics in here that everybody who's an owner, a breeder, a bettor, a backstretch employee, everybody involved in the game needs to know the inner workings of this concept, who's behind it, what they want, and why. And Steve Zorn, known to certainly everybody in New York with Castle Village and with his work on the New York Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association as an attorney, has so effectively demolished this concept point by point, going through its supposed findings and its working elements, and wrote on Friday an extensive analysis of the bill itself. We're happy to welcome Steve Zorn. Good morning.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Steve, just more or less, we want to turn it over to you. Give everybody an idea of what the concept to this is, the Tomco Bar bill, and who's behind it, and we'll go from there.
Okay, let's start, I think, with who's behind it. This is an effort at replacing state regulation of drugs in racing with national regulation. And the folks who've been promoting this for years now start with the Jockey Club, which is, of course, the elite, old aristocracy of racing. At one point, 100 years ago, they ran everything in racing. Folks who are part of the Jockey Club now probably still wish they could run everything in racing. And this is their effort to kind of get back some control from the states and from the horsemen's organizations. So they've promoted the bill as a way of sort of centralizing authority over racing, taking powers away from the various state regulatory commissions. The bill, as you said, Steve, is probably going nowhere in this Congress, but, once something gets introduced, it can take on a life of its own, and I and the other folks, especially around the New York Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association, who looked at it, thought we really should at least get the story of this thing out there so people can make their own judgment rather than just having to rely on the din of publicity that's being produced by the bill's supporters. I think there are two or three things that are most egregious in this bill. I mean, the first one is turning over drug enforcement in racing to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. And that's the organization that enforces international rules for Olympic athletes and other international competitions in the U.S. Problem is that the U.S. ADA knows absolutely nothing about racing. It doesn't even regulate the equine events in the Olympics, though these are enforced by a separate U.S. Equestrian Federation, which enforces international rules that apply to horses. USADA has never been in the business of regulating racing. So that, why would you hand over enforcement to an agency that knows nothing? At the same time, taking it away from the state regulatory commissions, which admittedly have problems, but we are making a lot of progress in racing and getting toward uniform rules nationwide, getting to uniform penalties for people who cheat. So that's all one issue. The other is that really this bill is all about Lasix. The folks who support it are also the folks who say that they want to get rid of Lasix in racing, even if they still run their own horses on Lasix. The bill refers to international standards, by which they mean no race day Lasix, because that's what Europe and much of the rest of the world does. We just have racing in the U.S. is very different from what it is in a lot of the rest of the world. We stable our horses at the track, where that's just not as healthy for horses as stabling them somewhere out in the country and turning them out a lot. Many racetracks are located in areas where there's a fair bit of pollution, and our horses do, in fact, need something to combat lung problems that helps them run up to their potential. Lasix really isn't a performance enhancer as much as it is a performance enabler. It lets a horse run the way the horse can run if the horse does not suffer from bleeding in the lungs. So I think those two, the lack of a knowledgeable enforcement agency and the single-minded focus on getting rid of Lasix, are really the two worst features of the bill. There are some others as well. The bill is to be funded by owners, and there's no limit on the price tag. Owning race horses is already, as I know personally and as I've done some research on, it's a losing enterprise. In New York, we used to have a rule of thumb that said horses earned roughly half of what it costs to keep them in training. Now that we have some money from the slot machines at Aqueduct, horses earn 75% of what it costs to keep them in training on average. But it's still a losing proposition, and adding additional costs will only make it harder, will only chase owners out of the business and add one more, kind of straw to the camel's back of really breaking down the racing industry.
Steve, you're kind of alluding to this, but is there a cost, or is there an estimate of the cost for this?
There is no estimate in the bill. All the bill says is whatever the cost is, it's to be paid by the horseman.
And Steve, on that topic, in terms of the elements, the vast majority of your piece actually goes systematically through the presentation portion of the bill, findings that the writers of the bill, Tomko and Barr, are presenting as supposed facts, when in fact, not only are the majority of them not factual, a lot of them are complete misrepresentations, and this is even before we even get to the questionable conduct and practice that USADA is involved in themselves. It got awfully quiet amongst the USADA supporters when it came out regarding their absolute disastrous handling of the most recent Mayweather testing that they're involved in.
Exactly. And, one of the things that is going on in the bill, most legislation that goes through Congress starts out with a set of what are called findings of fact. And those are supposed to set the stage, explain why the legislation is necessary, and also to give cover to the legislation in case it comes up in court and somebody argues that it's beyond Congress's authority. For one thing, Bill says these findings in the Tomko Barr bill say, well, there's a drug problem in racing. But then the bill applies only to thoroughbred racing. We all know there are lots of drug problems in standardbred quarter horse racing, but the bill doesn't address those at all. So it's going to leave drug enforcement split between the USADA, which would govern thoroughbreds. The state regulatory commissions would still have to govern all the other kinds of racing that's out there. they try to justify congressional action by saying, well, almost 50% of thoroughbreds race in more than one state, so it's interstate commerce. Technically, that's true, but really what's going on is they're talking about horses that race in the Mid-Atlantic: Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. And all of those states are among the states that are moving most quickly and most decisively toward a uniform drug policy. So that's precisely the area where you don't need any sort of further enforcement. It's Oklahoma and Louisiana, New Mexico, where we've had major drug problems, and where most of the horses that run there just run in that one state. So the bill is certainly misleading there. Another finding of fact in there is that at the beginning of the bill, they say it'll promote full and fair disclosure of information to purchasers of horses and to the wagering public. Well, that would be very nice, except the bill doesn't actually contain any provisions for sharing information. So that's just wrong. It says that the bill will improve the marketplace for domestic and international sales of thoroughbreds. That's been an argument that people have raised for 20 years. Well, we race on Lasix and we race on other drugs, and therefore none of the international buyers are going to come buy horses. If you go to the first 3-4 days of the Keeneland yearling sale, that's not true. Coolmore is there in force. Sheikh Mohammed and John Ferguson are there in force. Lots of international buyers take home lots of American-bred horses every year from those sales, and many of them turn into good runners and good sires over in Europe. So, I suppose one can show a little bit of a drop in purchases by foreigners at the U.S. sales, but there's been a bigger drop in purchases by Americans just because the industry has contracted a lot since the 2008 financial crisis.
Well, that's my favorite. You bring that one up, Steve. That's my favorite. That's my favorite whipping post of all of this nonsense. Is this absolute fallacy that the international buying community isn't interested in American bloodstock? They're buying up the best brood mares as eagerly as possible. It's funny. I think Escondrea is headed out of town. I'll have another. So on and so forth. I mean, there's all these American sires that are standing throughout the world, but yet they don't want our bloodstock. It's very strange and the fact that this gets even in the mainstream of the our trades here, blood horse and DRF. Somehow this seems to get just passed along like it's some sort of a fact. I see it written constantly, and it's just a lie. It's a bold-faced lie.
Well, it's like other forms of politics. If you repeat the lie enough, somebody's going to believe it. There's so many little things in the bill that are just misleading. One hardly knows where to go with it. They, again, in the findings of fact, they refer to a UNESCO convention about adopting measures to deal with the World Anti-Doping Code. Well, that's nice, but the World Anti-Doping Code deals with people, doesn't deal with horses. There's nothing about horses in any international convention or treaty that would require the U.S. to take action. So,
Steve, let me ask you here.
Let me give you one more, which kind of illustrates the lack of seriousness here. If the bill were adopted, there would be a horse racing drug authority that's set up by USADA, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. Starts out with the chair of USADA, that's Traverse Tiger, the guy who brought down Lance Armstrong. And then you have 5 board members from USADA itself, And then there's supposed to be 5 board members nominated from various racing industry constituencies. But the people who are nominated can't have any interest in horse racing. They can't be owners. They can't be state officials. They can't be anybody, in effect, who knows anything about racing. So it almost guarantees that you have a board that is incapable of making informed decisions, and the people who would be making decisions are the bureaucrats at USADA, who themselves don't know a whole lot about racing. It's just a model for reinventing the wheel and probably ending up with a wheel that's square.
And Steve, let me ask you, as I read through the piece, you're talking about state racing commissions, many of whom govern not only thoroughbreds but standardbreds. Some you fold in quarter horse breeds as well. What kind of problems does the bill present for those situations?
Well, it would take their thoroughbred medication jurisdiction away from them, but it wouldn't get rid of the state agencies. They would still be responsible for licensing and for enforcing other kinds of infractions. You know, suspending jockeys, for example, suspending trainers who don't do their paperwork right, suspending trainers and owners who end up sending horses to slaughter. So the state racing commissions would still be there. In those states that also have standardbred or quarter horse racing, they would have total enforcement. You know, you'd be creating another layer of enforcement and more expense without saving anything, and you undoubtedly end up with different standards. The thoroughbred standard would be different from whatever the states have in connection with quarter horses or with standardbreds. Now, sometimes that's justified. I know in New York there are slightly different rules for thoroughbreds and standardbreds, but sometimes it's not. You're duplicating the work. You're taking authority away from state commissions that in most cases have not done anything wrong, and you're sort of discouraging their efforts to improve the way they operate.
And Steve, to further expand on that portion of it, one of the things that does just boggle imagination is the fact that the group that continues, the coalition that continues to push this concept, this legislation, are doing so while the industry is in the midst of its most successful implementation of uniform medication guidelines and penalties that there's been since we eradicated steroids. And for whatever reason, the decision seems to have been made that the progress of RCI and of the RMTC, the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium, that this basically wants to run roughshod when in fact we're about 70, almost 80% complete in terms of getting implementation of the uniform guidelines approved. And the recent reality that the 2 most difficult states came along, Louisiana and Florida, who were the biggest concerns, they've come along under this now, and virtually there's no major jurisdiction left that isn't ready to be part of the uniform guidelines. So why does the Jockey Club and the WOA and the rest of the elite, why are they pushing this so hard when we've got something that can work and is in the process of working?
Well, because I think it's precisely because the process is working. The uniform medication rules process was, pushed along by the ordinary horsemen's groups, not initially by the Jockey Club or by the other Kentucky-based elitist organizations. And I think the folks at the Jockey Club see that it's working, and because it's working, it undermines what's left of their authority. I mean, this is just an attempt to pull back to themselves the control over the industry that they had in 1898.
Well, and you're joining with that comment, actually. Satish Sanan, for many years, when he was detailing attempts within the construct of the game, with 36 separate jurisdictions, constantly brought up that exact point, the control freaks that absolutely, to me, Steve, you brought up a great point as well in here. It's an ongoing attempt to neuter horsemen. And to basically, with the concept and with the suggestion of stripping the Interstate Horse Racing Act, what they're trying to do is take away horsemen's ability to control the signal. And once they do that, they've basically taken the control that you're suggesting.
Well, we're really familiar with that in New York. Because back in the 1970s, when the Interstate Horse Racing Act, which authorizes interstate betting on races, was passed, it included a provision, you said, that allows horsemen's organizations in each state to negotiate with the racetracks. And if they can't come to an agreement, then the horsemen have the right to pull the simulcast signal. Even back then, the Jockey Club folks were able to write in an exemption for New York. We're the only major horsemen's organization that does not have the collective bargaining rights because of the way that 1978 rule was written. And now they're trying to, in effect, extend that exemption to cover everybody in the whole country.
You brought up exactly a suggestion I made, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, when you suggested that this is a class war, and that's exactly what it is. I mean, pure and simple.
Well, I said that in the blog piece that we're talking about. You see it just sort of so obviously if you're involved in the business. If you're an owner with moderate priced horses, or you're a trainer working out at Aqueduct or on the Belmont breeding track, the folks who are pushing this bill are not your friends. They may be, if you're a trainer, they may give you a few horses to train, but they're the folks who want to run the whole industry. And they're rich enough so they don't care if they lose a little money along the way.
Absolutely well put. And Steve Zorn's piece in his business column, the business blog, that when he is motivated to put, I guess, pen to paper or fingers to keyboard.
Fingers to keyboard, right.
He always brings it when he does. Steve, can't thank you enough for this piece. We'll also, I want to have you on the radio where we've got, plenty of time to flesh out a lot more of these specifics, but it is essential reading, and it's at Facebook, on Steve's Facebook page, and at his link on CFV Partnerships at Twitter as well. I've also shared it and retweeted it, and Seth will have it at Equidaily as well. You have to read it. If you're a bettor, an owner, a breeder, a backstretch worker, anybody associated with the game that doesn't know what's at stake needs to familiarize themselves. Steve Zorn, thanks so much.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
Steve Zorn.